Imagine racing down the Illinois River at 30 miles an hour when suddenly the water in front of you explodes. A silver fish launches into the air, then another, then 10 more. Within seconds, fish weighing several pounds are flying over the boat, crashing against seats, equipment, and sometimes directly into the people inside. This is not some freak accident. It has become one of the most recognizable signs of an invasion that has been spreading through America's river system for decades. Asian carp. In certain stretches of the Illinois River, these fish became so abundant that almost everything seemed to revolve around them. Throw a net into the water and you might pull up carp. Drive a boat through a school and dozens can erupt from the surface. For years, government agencies tried almost everything imaginable to stop them. Electric barriers, commercial harvesting, poison, massive infrastructure projects, even plans involving underwater sound and bubbles. The reason for all this effort was simple. At the end of their path sits Lake Michigan, and beyond Lake Michigan lies the rest of the Great Lakes system, one of the most economically and ecologically important freshwater systems on Earth. Yet something strange eventually began happening. After decades of expansion, carp populations in parts of the Illinois River started showing signs of decline. Their northward movement also appeared to stall, and almost immediately, people found what seemed like the perfect explanation. A prehistoric predator had returned, a giant armored fish capable of growing longer than a person, a creature whose ancestors were swimming through North American rivers when dinosaurs still existed. The alligator gar. Illinois had begun putting this enormous native predator back into waters where it had disappeared decades earlier, and the timing seemed almost too perfect. Asian carp numbers were dropping, alligator gar were returning, so the story practically wrote itself. America had brought back an ancient river monster to destroy an invasive species. There was only one problem. That isn't what happened. And the real explanation for what has been slowing the carp invasion is much stranger, because part of America's defense against these fish may have been created completely by accident. To understand how, we need to go back to the moment these fish arrived. During the 1970s, fish farms across parts of the southern United States faced a persistent problem. Their ponds were filling with algae and microscopic organisms. Instead of constantly treating the water with chemicals, producers looked for a biological solution. In Asia, several species of carp had already been used because they were extremely efficient filter feeders. They could consume enormous amounts of plankton suspended in the water. So fish, including silver carp and bighead carp, were imported into the United States. Inside controlled ponds, the idea made sense. Put the fish in, let them consume excessive biological growth, keep the water cleaner. Simple. But rivers do not care about human plans. Flooding allowed some of these fish to escape from captivity. Once they entered the Mississippi River basin, containment became almost impossible. The Mississippi is not one isolated river. It is the center of an enormous network stretching across much of the country. Tributaries connect to tributaries. Channels connect watersheds. And eventually, the carp moved north through the Illinois River. What followed became an ecological nightmare. Asian carp possess several characteristics that make them extraordinarily successful invaders. The first is reproduction. A large female silver carp can produce hundreds of thousands of eggs during a spawning event, with some estimates reaching beyond 1 million. Under the right river conditions, enormous numbers of fish can reproduce at once. But reproduction alone isn't what makes them dangerous. The real problem is food. Silver carp and bighead carp feed heavily on plankton, tiny organisms floating in the water column. To humans, plankton may seem insignificant, but inside a river ecosystem, plankton represents the first meal for countless organisms. Young native fish depend on it, small bait fish depend on it, and larger predators depend on those fish. Asian carp don't need to hunt base. They don't need to kill catfish. They don't need to attack native species directly. They simply consume enormous amounts of food before other animals can reach it. Imagine an entire city depending on one supermarket. Now imagine millions of outsiders arriving every morning and emptying every shelf before anyone else wakes up. Nobody is attacked. Nobody is chased. but everyone eventually goes hungry. That is essentially what happens inside the ecosystem, and as carp populations exploded, scientists began observing changes in native fish communities. The concern became even greater because the Illinois River leads toward Chicago, and Chicago contains the connection everyone fears: a human-made waterway linking the Mississippi River Basin with Lake Michigan. If large populations of invasive carp managed to cross that final section and establish themselves in the Great Lakes, the consequences could be enormous. The Great Lakes support commercial fishing, recreational fishing, tourism, shipping, drinking water systems, and complex native ecosystems. Tens of millions of people depend on them, so stopping carp became one of the largest invasive species battles in North America. In 2002, an electrical barrier was installed in the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. The idea was straightforward: create an electrical field strong enough to discourage fish from swimming farther toward Lake Michigan. But nobody wanted to depend entirely on electricity. Over time, additional defenses were proposed: bubble barriers, acoustic deterrents, more advanced electrical systems, locks, engineering modifications, and eventually one project began attracting enormous attention: Brandon Road. The proposed defense system near Joliet, Illinois, became one of the most ambitious attempts ever created to stop an invasive freshwater fish. Its projected cost climbed toward roughly $1 billion and beyond as plans evolved. America was preparing to build what was essentially a fortress inside a river, all because of a fish. But while engineers planned new barriers, something interesting was already happening farther downstream. In several monitored areas, carp abundance began falling, and around the same time, another fish was returning to Illinois: the alligator gar. Few freshwater fish in North America look more intimidating. A mature alligator gar can grow several feet long. Large individuals can weigh hundreds of pounds. Its head resembles something halfway between a fish and an alligator. Its long jaws contain rows of sharp teeth, and its body is covered in thick, armor-like scales. The lineage of gars stretches back tens of millions of years. They survived enormous environmental changes that eliminated countless other species. For generations, however, many Americans viewed them as pests. Gar were frequently killed because fishermen believed they damaged valuable sport fish populations. Wetlands were altered, floodplains were isolated, spawning habitat disappeared, and throughout parts of their historical range, alligator gar populations collapsed. Eventually, Illinois considered the species gone from the state. Then, wildlife managers decided to bring it back. Beginning around 2010, young alligator gar were released into Illinois waters as part of restoration efforts. Thousands of juvenile fish entered places where their species had not been established for decades. And that's when the perfect story emerged. A massive ancient predator had returned to a river filled with invasive carp. Carp numbers were falling. Obviously, people thought the gar must be eating them. It sounded brilliant. Restore the natural predator and let nature repair itself. No billion-dollar barrier required. No poison. No endless fleets of fishing boats. Just one enormous native fish eating another. And there was enough truth inside the story to make it believable. Alligator gar are opportunistic predators. They eat fish. If small Asian carp are available, gar can certainly consume them. Researchers studying gar diets have even found invasive carp among their prey in parts of their range. But there is a huge difference between eating some carp and controlling an invasion involving millions of carp. Start with the numbers. Illinois released thousands of juvenile gar, but only a fraction would survive long enough to become large adults. Meanwhile, Asian carp populations were not being discussed in thousands of individuals. In heavily invaded regions, their abundance was measured in enormous quantities of biomass, tons of fish. Even a healthy gar population would struggle to consume carp faster than carp could replace themselves. Then there was another problem: size. Adult silver carp quickly become large, deep-bodied fish. Young gar can eat juvenile carp. Large gar may capture bigger individuals, but there is no realistic scenario where a relatively small population of gar simply swims through the Illinois River, consuming enough adult carp to collapse the invasion. The people involved with gar restoration understood this. Their objective had never been to create a biological weapon against Asian carp. They were restoring a native species. That alone was valuable. The gar belonged in these waters long before humans removed them. Returning it was an ecological restoration project, not an anti-carp military operation. But compared with that explanation, prehistoric monster released to eat invasive fish sounded much better. So the myth survived. Meanwhile, the carp numbers were still changing. Something really was pushing them back. If it wasn't the giant predator, what was it? The first answer is incredibly ordinary: fishermen. For years, Illinois has supported aggressive commercial removal programs. Teams go on to invaded waters specifically looking for carp. The objective isn't recreational fishing, it's extraction. Remove as much biomass as possible. And when the state began adding financial incentives, carp suddenly became worth catching in huge quantities. A few cents per pound does not sound like much, but when a boat returns carrying thousands of pounds of fish, those small incentives add up. Multiply that across years of organized harvesting, and the numbers become enormous. Tens of millions of pounds of invasive carp have been removed from Illinois waterways, not by giant predators, by humans using nets. But they didn't simply throw nets randomly into the river. Some operations became surprisingly sophisticated. One technique was adapted from methods used by fishermen who had worked with carp for generations. Instead of trying to chase individual fish, crews manipulate entire schools. Nets create temporary underwater boundaries. Boats generate sound and disturbance. Carp instinctively move away from the noise. Workers gradually concentrate the fish into smaller and smaller sections of water. Eventually, thousands can become trapped inside one enclosed area. Then the nets close. One coordinated operation can remove enormous quantities of carp. But perhaps the cleverest technique turns the fish themselves into informants. Researchers and fisheries crews capture individual carp and attach radio transmitters. Then they release them. Carp are social fish. The tagged individual eventually searches for other carp. It joins a school. And now the fishermen don't have to search miles of river hoping to find the invasion. They follow the signal. The carp leads them directly to other carp, a Judas fish. The invader becomes the tracking device used to locate its own population. Crews also focus heavily on the leading edge of the invasion. The closer carp move toward Chicago, the more dangerous each reproductive adult becomes. Removing large adults before they move farther upstream means fewer eggs. Fewer eggs mean fewer juveniles. Fewer juveniles mean less pressure on the barriers protecting Lake Michigan. Then, Illinois tried another strategy that sounded almost ridiculous. Instead of simply destroying the fish, why not convince Americans to eat them? There was one immediate problem: the word carp. For many American consumers, carp has a terrible reputation. People imagine muddy flavor, bones, or undesirable fish. Yet invasive carp species can produce mild white meat and are consumed widely elsewhere in the world. So Illinois attempted something marketers have done countless times before: change the name. In 2022, the fish was rebranded as copy. The idea came from the word copious, because there was certainly a copious amount of it. Chefs experimented with tacos, burgers, fish dishes, and processed products. The strategy created a simple economic loop. If restaurants buy copy, processors need more fish. If processors need more fish, commercial fishermen catch more carp. And every fish sold is another invasive fish removed from the river. Suddenly, humans weren't just fighting the invasion, they were trying to eat it. But commercial harvesting explains only part of the mystery, because for years, scientists noticed something else. As carp moved north through the Illinois River, their progression slowed dramatically before reaching Lake Michigan. There was no giant waterfall, no massive physical barrier, and the strongest engineered defenses weren't located exactly where the populations began changing. Something in the environment itself seemed unfavorable. Researchers started looking more closely at the river, and the explanation turned out to be one of the strangest twists in the entire story. The closer the Illinois River gets to the heavily urbanized Chicago region, the more dramatically the habitat changes. Natural banks disappear. Concrete replaces vegetation. Industrial development surrounds the river. Locks and dams interrupt the system. Water quality changes. For fish trying to invade upstream, this region can become extremely hostile. Research examining water collected from sections closer to Chicago found that young silver carp performed differently when exposed to those conditions. Instead of behaving like fish in ideal habitat, they became slower and more stressed. The river itself appeared to be demanding additional energy, simply for survival. That matters because migration is expensive. Spawning is expensive. Growth is expensive. A fish only has so much energy. If more of that energy is spent tolerating poor environmental conditions, less remains available for everything else, and habitat becomes another problem. Successful carp reproduction requires more than 2 adult fish meeting each other. Eggs and larvae need the right river conditions. Young fish need suitable areas to survive. Highly engineered channels surrounded by concrete do not provide the same habitat as wide natural floodplains, so decades of human damage may have accidentally created something nobody intended: an ecological barrier, pollution, concrete, shorelines, modified river channels, locks, dams. Each factor alone may not stop the fish. Together, they make the final approach toward Chicago increasingly difficult. The irony is extraordinary. For years, the United States has considered spending enormous amounts of money building sophisticated defenses to protect Lake Michigan. Yet part of the existing defense appears to come from the fact that humans already transformed the river so severely that the invasive fish doesn't particularly want to live there. In other words, environmental degradation may temporarily be helping prevent an environmental disaster. That doesn't mean the Great Lakes are safe. Far from it. Individual invasive carp have been discovered beyond areas where managers wanted them. Whenever that happens, teams search aggressively for evidence of a breeding population. So far, the nightmare scenario everyone fears, enormous self-sustaining schools of silver and bighead carp establishing themselves throughout Lake Michigan, has not happened. But the invasion has not disappeared either. Large populations remain farther downstream. Every spring, the reproductive machine starts again. Millions of eggs can enter the system, and the entire defense depends on constant pressure. Commercial fishermen have to keep fishing. Government programs have to keep paying. Monitoring teams have to keep searching. Electrical barriers have to keep operating. Remove enough of those defenses, and the balance could change very quickly. This is why Brandon Road still matters. Engineers want a barrier that doesn't depend entirely on annual harvesting or unfavorable river habitat. A permanent choke point where multiple deterrents work together. Electricity, sound, bubble systems, physical modifications. The idea is not necessarily to destroy every carp. It's to make the final path toward Lake Michigan so difficult that a breeding population never establishes itself. But major infrastructure takes years. It requires billions of dollars. State governments argue over costs. Federal funding changes. Contracts move slowly, and carp continue, reproducing while humans debate. Meanwhile, the alligator gar keeps swimming through Illinois waters, and perhaps that's where the strangest misunderstanding in this entire story becomes clear. The gar does not need to defeat the carp to be a success. Humans nearly erased it from these rivers. Now it is returning. Young fish released years ago are growing larger. Anglers have another native giant to pursue. And a predator that once occupied an important ecological position is gradually returning to its historical range. That is already remarkable. Turning the gar into a superhero almost cheapens the real achievement. It isn't an anti-carp weapon. It's a species coming home. And the carp? They're still here. Drive a boat through the right section of river, and silver carp can still explode from the surface. Bodies flash in the sunlight. Fish slam back into the water. For a few seconds, the river looks completely out of control. But behind that chaos is one of the most complicated invasive species battles in America. There is no single hero. No giant prehistoric fish solving everything. No miracle technology. Instead, there are commercial fishermen dragging thousands of pounds from the water, tagged carp leading crews toward hidden schools, restaurants trying to convince customers to eat an invasive species, electric fields beneath canals, engineers planning billion-dollar barriers, and an urban river so heavily modified that its poor habitat may itself be slowing the invasion. And that creates one final paradox. Imagine that one day, Chicago completely restores this river. Pollution declines. Natural shorelines return. Fish habitat improves. Water quality becomes dramatically better. Normally, that would be considered an environmental victory. But better habitat might also make the final route toward Lake Michigan easier for invasive carp. The same ecological restoration that helps native wildlife could potentially remove one of the accidental obstacles currently slowing the invaders, which means America may eventually face one of the strangest environmental problems imaginable. How do you restore a damaged river without opening the door for something even worse? After decades of fighting Asian carp, perhaps that is the real lesson of the Illinois River. Nature rarely gives us simple villains, and it almost never gives us simple solutions. The giant predator wasn't the answer. The billion-dollar barrier isn't finished. The carp haven't vanished. And for now, the Great Lakes remain protected by an imperfect combination of fishermen, technology, geography, damaged habitat, and constant human intervention. A defense system nobody would ever have designed this way. But somehow, at least for now, it's holding. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe and stay with us for more incredible stories about wildlife, science, and the hidden battles taking place in ecosystems around the world. Because sometimes the strangest environmental stories aren't about the monster everyone is watching. They're about the invisible forces quietly deciding who survives.